Well, Jess Pryles, welcome to Biscuits and Jam.
I'm stoked to be here. I was wondering if we should call it scones and jam, but we'll go with biscuits and jam.
Maybe for today. What'd you say, scones?
Yeah, it's scones is just the American pronunciation, but
scones.
Yeah, Brits and Australians call it scones.
Oh, really?
Yeah, truly.
I've learned something already, and we're only a minute in.
There you go.
Well, so speaking of Australia, you're the first person that I've ever interviewed from Australia, at least on this podcast.
What an honor.
So I'm very curious to hear about your life there. You know, what was it like growing up? I believe you grew up in Melbourne, right?
Yeah, I feel like it's appropriate for an Australian expat to be on Southern Living, since it is the Southern Hemisphere. So arguably the most South, right?
Right. You're the most Southern person I may have ever interviewed.
There you go. I grew up in Melbourne. Melbourne's a really cosmopolitan city, about 5 million people, probably about 3 when I was growing up. Lots of museums, lots of culture. It's if Sydney is LA, Melbourne is more New York, is how we sort of describe it. But I was, very urban, very disconnected from agriculture, kind of just a normal city life, used to a lot of traffic and a lot of people and a lot of tight spaces.
That's interesting that you kind of grew up in an urban environment. Just given your trajectory, your career, you seem to be certainly drawn a little bit more toward rural spaces. And, barbecue kind of lends itself to that world a little more.
Yeah, you definitely need a little more space than a urban balcony to really dig deep into barbecue. But I think it was actually visiting Texas for the first time that ignited my appreciation for sort of more space and outdoor activities. Obviously, barbecue's a huge one of those, but there's so much, the ranch lifestyle, live fire cooking, even learning to hunt when I moved here. I'm in Austin now. I have been for 9 years now. So everything happened at the same time, this sort of developing a love for Texas and also developing meat knowledge. They happened at the same time as I was learning about barbecue.
Yeah. So that's not like you had a base layer of learning all this in Australia. You were really new to it when you came to Texas.
Yeah, very much so. We didn't have, I always loved eating meat, eating steaks, but wasn't really sure how to cook them. Wasn't really sure what to choose at the grocery store, so I just left it to being a restaurant experience. And I think that there's so much more of a connection with certainly barbecue, but just outdoor live fire cooking here that it opens your world up. And it was this huge shift in what was available compared to being, in that really urban environment. And the other thing is Australia didn't have American style barbecue. It's huge there now, wildly popular. I mean, obviously, right? Everywhere it's caught on like wildfire, but it just didn't exist. We have a pretty embarrassing culture of barbecue, to be honest with you. Shrimp on the Barbie is an American thing. That was an ad that was just for America because Australians call them prawns. But it was more like the most common thing was either a propane grill or a griddle, and you would buy the cheapest sausages at the grocery store and just kind of cremate them until they were slightly burnt. And that would pass as like a really standard Aussie community barbecue. So the first time that I ever tried smoked meats in the true Texas essence of it was visiting Austin, 15, 16 years ago. And I just remember it was unlike anything that I'd ever tried before in terms of the flavors and the crunchy, crispy membrane on the bottom of these beef ribs and the big salt and pepper hit. And it absolutely was a life-changing meal because, 5 years later, I ended up moving across an ocean because of it.
That's so interesting. I mean, what a discovery for you, to be tasting that for the first time and, especially for someone who loves food, I guess, and to experience that for the first time after growing up around, I don't know, whatever they were doing in Melbourne, but it wasn't this kind of cooking.
I don't want to, I do say, Sid, I feel bad because I feel like I'm painting Melbourne in a really bad light. It has an incredibly vibrant food culture. It's got amazing Southeast Asian cuisine and modern Australian. It's just not barbecue
Right.
yet.
Well, it
now.
is now. It's
It
much
is now.
more, right?
Much more, yes.
Tell me a little bit about your family, your mom and dad. I saw that you dedicated your book, Hardcore Carnivore, to them. Um, Tell me a little bit about them and what they did for a living.
Yeah. My dad was a law professor for many years and then ended up going into practice and specializing in arbitration, which is basically where you're a judge but between two private parties. And he was always big on promoting academia and study. And, I'd go visit him in his law professor office as a little kid and look up at the books and try my best to read them. And my mom was a school teacher, and they're still married. They still live in the house that I got brought home from the hospital to in Melbourne. So it was a big deal to move away from that. And I had a very normal, I'm extremely grateful to say it, but very traditional upbringing, and couldn't have asked for better parents. And they were just very encouraging and supportive. And, there were rules and structure, but you were encouraged to go and seek greater things.
So who was doing the cooking, Jess? I mean, somewhere along the line, you must have had a spark of inspiration when it comes to food and cooking.
So it's really interesting, actually, and I haven't talked much about this before, but both of my parents are first-generation Australians, and each of them are the children of the Second World War immigrants. So my mum is the child of Holocaust survivors. My family's Jewish. And my dad's parents immigrated before the war, but because things were getting really bad in Austria. And because of that, when my grandparents immigrated, they were refugees, and they didn't really have an incredible repertoire of family history and recipes and ingredients. They barely brought anything with them. My mum couldn't cook at all. Dad jokes that she could barely boil water when they got married. And my grandmother would sort of try. She was an excellent baker, but not a great cook. So Dad did a lot of the cooking, I think, when Mum first got married. Mum's an amazing cook now. She's really come into her own. But I think it's just that idea of your history really and your environment really impacting that. So because, my grandmother could never, and she's still with us as well, she's going to be 100 next year, but she could never throw out anything that had mold on it. If you had a moldy, bell pepper or something, she'd just cut that away. There was no wastage. That was really the approach to food there. And because we grew up eating kosher meat, which obviously I do not now, my exposure to cuts was also really limited too. So you just get a delivery from the kosher butchers every couple of weeks, and you just got what you got, because traditionally in kosher meat, they only use the forequarter of the animal. So you're also really limited to how much you've even tried. And that was I think, had a lot to do with why I had such limited exposure to understanding meat cuts and how to cook it as a kid as well. Dad would man the gas barbecue from time to time, but everything would be well done.
Yeah, right. Which is not your approach these days.
Very much not.
Wow, that's fascinating. So you travel around and you're passing through Texas. And this is, what'd you say, 15, 16 years ago, you're traveling through Texas. Obviously, you decide to stay. I'm sure this was over a period of time, but tell me about that first visit, or those first couple of visits, and what was it that really, that you kind of fell for?
So it was really interesting. So there were a couple of things that fell into place before I even got to Texas. One, my dad was actually an exchange student in '68 at SMU, and he'd always talked about his time in Texas with a lot of...
So you had the Texas connection.
Vaguely, yes. Yeah. There was a lot of fond memories for him there. And then for whatever reason, Australians are really good at traveling. We're on an island on the other side of the world. We have a lot of annual leave, and if you need to go to even New Zealand, it's a 4-hour flight. So we're not afraid of getting in a plane and going places. So I would always, my mom had taken us to the US when I was younger, sort of, the Hawaii Disneyland obligatory trip, because, that's the route from Australia. And I'd always been fascinated with American culture. That was the time that we were just starting, when I was sort of around 12, 13, 14, starting to get cable in Australia. And we would start to get, the Nickelodeon shows, all the American TV shows, more so than the British shows we'd always grew up with. And I was just fascinated by it. And then as I grew older, I became fascinated with the culture of the South in particular. And I remember buying a Lonely Planet guide, because this was pre-internet.
I remember those. Yeah, sure.
A Lonely Planet guide to, it was Louisiana and the Deep South. And the front cover of it just had all of these cypress trees dripping with Spanish moss. And I poured through that book like it was no one's business. There was something about, what I did grow up with in my house was Mom had fine china for good occasions, and she had good silverware for good occasions, and the ones where you had to know which fork was which. And there were echoes of that in some of the big grand old Southern traditions. And so that resonated with me as a bit more familiar than even a casual Australian upbringing, because I am only second generation, right? So, and then it's just gorgeous, the idea of those beautiful old houses and the trees. And I ended up going on this giant road trip through the entire South and just thinking, this is gorgeous and it's so interesting. And I would try and find skillets. Like I went on the hunt for my own vintage skillet and tried to teach myself sort of basic recipes, like understanding what's a biscuit? How is it different from a scone? Because that's the number one question I'm asked by my Australian followers still anytime I post about biscuits. What's the difference between them? There is a slight difference. But I always felt like a visitor and a traveler. And I got to Texas on one of these eventual trips. And it was when Austin was absolutely in its heyday. I mean, everyone is moving here now. It was a smaller city back then. It was much easier to get around. It was much more about small independent businesses than sort of big tech companies. And Texans have a unique approach in that if you love Texas as much as Texans do, you're a Texan. You don't need a family history. You don't need to show that you have roots here. Just, wave a big Texas flag and love it as much as they do, and they'll welcome you with open arms. And it was a different – Texas is Southern but not Southern. It's Southwestern but not Southwestern. It's just Texas. So it was sort of like all the best of all of these wonderful feelings that I'd been exposed to in learning and traveling through the South. So I adored Austin. I adored all the people I was meeting, all the Texans that I was meeting. And then as I kept visiting before I moved, I really, really dove into the culture. So barbecue was absolutely the main funnel. But then there were other things, as I mentioned, like I really wanted to learn to hunt because I thought baby deer were really cute. But I also eat a lot of meat, so I wanted to put my money where my mouth was. And it was also just a very traditional Texan pastime that I felt I really wanted to be a part of that, at least experience it to understand a little bit more about what's involved, why people do it, why it's so important to them. So I've done, learned to two-step. It was nearly, it's a little bit stereotypical, but I feel like I've made a pretty decent honorary Texan now.
Oh, I mean, for sure. And I love that you just embraced it so much and thrown yourself into it. I think that's the only way to do it.
Definitely.
And I've heard that people that move to Texas, when you show that you really love it, that's kind of all that matters, and that you're happy to be there and that you want to be part of the community, and they really do kind of roll out the welcome mat.
They do. And it's been, I think that's, why there has been so much growth overall in Texas. But it certainly made me feel like home. That's also how I grew my social media following at the same time. That was the golden age before we had the word influencer or creator, where people were genuinely posting things to share their stories, not to try and curate a lifestyle. And I was having people follow along, watching me fall in love with Texas. And a lot of them were Texans. A lot of them were Australians back then, kind of just following, living vicariously. But a lot of them were Texans, just nearly in a, it was weird, nearly in a parental position of sort of watching, like, you know, a child, not that I was, but a child take their first steps and learn about all the, you know, go swimming in the blue hole in Wimberley for the first time, or, you know, whatever, go to their first football game, which is, you know, a huge deal. So people, I can totally appreciate how people would like to see somebody new celebrate something that they hold so dearly.
You know, speaking of learning things, you know, a lot of your journey has been about learning, and particularly when it comes to cooking. I mean, learning the art of cooking and seasoning meat, the art of barbecue, and the art of grilling. And, you know, I'm wondering if you had to pick one person who was sort of your biggest mentor when it came to all of that, who would that be, and what's their story?
There was a gentleman who has passed away now, unfortunately. And I will tell you this, he would have made a great pirate or something, because I have a lot of love for him on the one hand, and on the other hand, he just wasn't a great human being. And I say that with context. His name was John Miller, and he was the son of Bobby Miller of the famous smokehouse in Taylor, Texas, of Louis Miller Barbecue, which was the grandfather. And John was the black sheep of the family. And he certainly got involved in some stuff that wasn't great, which luckily I was never on that side of. But what he was great at was barbecue. He had it in his blood. His sister, who unfortunately has passed away as well, Leanne Miller, who was an incredible photographer, also opened a barbecue joint now called La Barbecue. And his half-brother Wayne continues on at Louis Miller. But way back in the day in Austin, when barbecue was just starting to be a thing, when I first came to Texas, the barbecue joints you could visit were all had many, many years under their belt. This explosion of new joints and new places on the list was really not happening that much yet. There were maybe 2 or 3 newish places in Austin, and he was doing one of them. And he was running a trailer, and everything was just accessible back then. And he ended up teaching Ali Clem, who's now the pitmaster at La Barbecue. He taught her how to cook, and he taught me as well. So I would stage overnight with him and watch him do an overnight cook on the pit, or he'd let me cut the brisket, be there while he was seasoning. They call it staging in French, which is basically just, you know, hanging out and working at the restaurant without being paid. You're basically getting paid in knowledge. And that's who really taught me how to barbecue, and all of the things that he'd learned and all of the things that he'd picked up along the way. And it gave me a tremendous amount of knowledge. And, you know, sadly, he had his own struggles and passed away just in the last couple of years. But I'll always be grateful to him for what he taught me.
You know, you're talking about the kind of transformation of barbecue in Texas and in Austin, especially. And we did a story last year about women in Texas barbecue specifically. You were in that story, and there was a group of them, I think it was 7 or so, who are really doing amazing things in barbecue and really kind of leading the next generation of cooks and pitmasters. And I'm curious what you see happening these days when it comes to women in barbecue. Does it feel like, you know, there really is kind of a shift happening, or that there's a lot of, you know, momentum when it comes to that?
It does. It was a big, big honor to be featured in that article, because I've been a reader for such a long time. It was a little bit giddy when I first got told I'd be a part of it. So there are a lot of women making their way, and some unsung in Texas barbecue, which is what was so valuable about that article. Not everyone has a big social media profile to promote themselves. A lot of them are just back of house pit masters themselves, just going in and doing their jobs. And it's not an easy job. It's very physically demanding to be a pit master, at least in Texas style barbecue. I mean, I keep saying Texas style. There is a difference, just as in the same as in Pat Martin will tell you, West Tennessee whole hog. It's not that physically easy to flip an entire hog in a hog pit. It's not that easy to continually open up these 1,000-gallon steel pits and move, dozens of briskets around on your own. So I definitely think we are seeing more and more women come into it, and just for the right reasons, just because they love it, not because they're trying to fly the flag of I'm a woman and I can do it too. That's certainly never been the case for me. It's more coming from such a genuine, earnest place. Chuck, who was also profiled in the story, has Barb's BQ in Lockhart. She's become an overnight success. And she has an all-female team, which is really impressive. So I think that there's a lot of room there. And I also think that on a domestic level, pellet grills opened up the door for a lot of women who we revere our grandmothers and our moms for being amazing cooks. And we want to collect their cookbooks and, their old scribbled, well-worn, well-loved cookbooks. But we've automatically just relegated outdoor duties to dads and brothers. And I think the biggest part about that was the intimidation of the actual live fire part of it. We may have gone to home ec while the boys went to scouts or learned to light fires. So when you bring in a pellet grill where you can literally just flick a switch and you're smoking, we've seen a huge uptick in more women being confident about cooking their signature dishes just on a smoker. And I'm sure anyone could learn to light a fire. It's not rocket science. Even the cavemen could do it, right? But I love that it's just making it more accessible as a flavor profile and as a cooking method.
Well, Jess, I want to talk about your new show a little bit. You've got a new TV show coming out, and it's on the Outdoor Channel.
It is.
Tell me a little bit about the name and the premise and what it's all about.
Absolutely. I'm so excited. This has been a long time coming. We filmed last year, and we're actually on the road filming season 2 already. But the show premieres on September 23rd on the Outdoor Channel at 9:30 Eastern, and it is called Hardcore Carnivore. And any of your listeners who are familiar with me already or that brand, that's actually the name of the brand that I founded about a year after I moved to Texas. We have seasonings and tools for grilling and live fire cooking that I use in my own home and my own kitchens. And it just made a lot of sense. Ironically, Hardcore Carnivore was named prior to the rise in popularity of the carnivore diet. So I do want to clarify, it is not a diet. It is just a really fun little name for anyone who loves eating meat. And so when I got approached to do the show, we talked about how we can really come full circle and encompass all aspects of meat eating. Because one of the parts of my story is after sort of getting involved in barbecue, learning as much as I could and feeling that I was pretty on top of it, I got more curious about other parts of it and the meat itself. So much so that I ended up going back and doing a graduate certificate at Iowa State University in meat science. So when we were doing the show, we wanted to look at all aspects, how meat is raised, how meat is hunted. We want to make it really fun and a fun thing to watch. Not just sort of, you're not just going to sit there and watch me stand there in a lab coat. We've got recipes and cooking in every episode as well. And it's the full spectrum, the sort of round the world of all things meat. The other thing that was important to me was really to show, as I said, that commercial aspect of meat. A lot of hunters that I know, most hunters in Texas, a lot of hunters through the South, will not exclusively live on venison or their game. They will often say, hey, my death row meal would be a ribeye if I could. And so I think that a realistic approach is to celebrate game and celebrate, domesticated meats like beef and pork and lamb and chicken, all of it.
there's some crossover there, certainly when it comes to cooking and
Definitely.
what you're going to do with that meat. I saw the other day that you had been in, I think it's Madisonville, Tennessee, visiting Allan Benton
Mhm.
and Benton's Bacon and the smokehouse there. Tell me a little bit about that experience and what that was like, what that has to do with the show.
That was season 2. So we are on the road, as I mentioned, doing season 2. And part of that, again, just that full world of things are also other people who are producing meat really well. And Benton's came up very early for me, especially being a Southern Living reader. You hear about it a lot, about this sort of legendary ham. And I had to learn what country ham was when I moved here. I knew what city ham was from Waffle House menus. It's a joke. Um, but I wasn't quite sure what country ham was. I'm like, oh, okay, you mean like Hamani Iberico, but country. Okay, that makes sense. So I'd just long heard about Bentons and how they've been doing things in a really old style, to the point where some of their practices are grandfathered in by the USDA, because you certainly wouldn't be allowed to use wooden racks like they are still doing today. And Allan is a curing nerd. He, put his whole life and career on the line to make this bacon. He's just handed off to his son, Daryl. So it was incredible to meet them and to learn about their process. I got to have their mom, Sharon's famous biscuits, and get a masterclass there. It was an incredible trip, honestly. Really.
What a great place to go visit, and a great time to be there, when they have this kind of transition happening, being passed from, father to son. And so I look forward to seeing that episode when that comes around. I mean, Jess, as someone who knows as much as you do, and being a meat science graduate now, um, I'm wondering, if feel like you're learning a lot. You must be, even now, just going to all these places. I bet every time you film a new episode, every time you talk to somebody else, you're probably learning something else about cooking meat and different ways you can do it. Is that the case?
Definitely. Definitely. I think that the reason this has been my job for more than 15 years now, and I'm constantly learning and constantly sort of going down new avenues of different things that you can learn about. And, a big part of it is getting to explore. It's the same thing I think that people love about traveling. Just you think you know everything about a grocery store or a market, and then you go overseas and see it in another country, and it sort of blows your mind, or how people cook or how they use ingredients. And that's the same, it's the same attitude that we have on the show. And my area of expertise lies in the meat and the cooking, but I didn't grow up on a ranch. I don't really have huge exposure to it. So when we go and visit animal producers as well, in the first episode, we were at a bison farm or bison ranch and a goat farm. And to understand what goes into breeding the animal, growing it, keeping it healthy, there's so much there that there's just a constant learning process. And even in hunting as well, my experience was limited to hunting in Texas, which is, dove and whitetail and maybe some turkey. And to be able to go with friends that I trust to show me other states, other hunting terrains, other ways to get the meat. And then it all comes back together to when we're actually cutting up that animal and processing it. That's when it becomes familiar, and I can share with my friend who has shared me all of her knowledge. I can let her know, well, hey, you can also do this to it when you're cleaning it, and this is actually a great steak, and this is how you should cook it. So it's very fulfilling. It's very fun to do. We have a great crew, so it's just fun. We're making jokes the whole time, and what I really hope is that it's an enjoyable watch for people, but that there's also some really fun little nuggets and interesting points of conversation and topics that people can glean from the shows as well.
Real takeaways, yeah.
Yeah.
You're going 100 miles an hour all the time. I mean, you've got the TV show, you're doing events, You're running a spice business. What do you do to take a break?
I was going to tell you there's no such thing as a break, but I did just get back from a vacation last week, which was the first just vacation I've taken in a very long time. But I don't think when you're an entrepreneur that you ever truly switch off. And I love what I do, and that helps tremendously. You know, I was just in Nashville earlier this week with Kingsford, who I've got an amazing partnership with. And even that is, you know, I still think it's incredible that someone who was an immigrant less than a decade ago can come across and be working with one of the most recognized brands in American fuel as an ambassador for them, you know, or working with Browning when we do hunting things, and as someone who's effectively a new hunter as well. And so, yeah, it's a lot of work, but I don't think I'd have it any other way.
Yeah, I get that impression. All right. Well, I want to talk about recipes. So, you know, we did a survey recently with our readers. We're always asking them things about what's on their mind, what they like to cook, that sort of thing. And we recently were talking about grilling and asked about their favorite thing to grill. And of course, you know, it's no surprise that they said hamburgers. I mean, that's what most people are grilling probably more often than anything else. What is your go-to technique for a really good hamburger?
It starts with the raw product. Surprise, surprise. If you can grind your own, great. I don't think that that's a make or break. I don't think everyone needs to run out and get a meat grinder, but I definitely would always recommend buying freshly ground beef rather than the stuff that comes in the chubs. It has a different texture. It can often have a different water holding capacity. And if you can experiment with the different muscles as well. So some grocery stores, like the ones we have here in Texas, will specify, is it chuck? Is it sirloin? You want to look at that fat percentage as well. I'm looking for at least 80-20, 80% lean, 20% fat, which is pretty conservative by restaurant standards. We think of that as a really high fat percentage for us as consumers. But realistically, the most luxurious sort of steakhouse burger might even be up in the 70-30
Oh, really?
brackets. Yeah, very much so. In fact, Billy Durney, who runs Hometown Barbecue in Brooklyn, he once brought some Pat LaFrieda burgers to Memphis in May where we were cooking together, and they were practically white because I think it was a 60-40.
Wow.
But they were the most luscious, you know, flavorful, juicy burgers you can imagine. So definitely an 80-20. Be really loose. I'd be really loose with how I form the patty. You don't want to overwork the meat fibers. It can make it tougher. I saw something from Heston Blumenthal once where he actually tries to capture the muscle fibers as they're extruded from the grinder and then lay everything in the same direction until it's roughly the circumference of a patty, and then cut that way, because technically that way you're then biting in between the strands, which is less resistant than biting through the strands. So you can get real technical about this if you want to.
This is your meat science coming through.
Yeah, this is more chef nerd stuff, but I think it all comes together. It's all curious people. So I handle it as least as possible, and I put nothing in it until I start cooking it. The idea of adding anything else, when Mom used to make us burgers when I was little, she would put in parsley, garlic, salt, an egg, and I sort of had to explain to her as I grew up, you're making a meatball, you're making rissoles. You're not making a burger if you're putting all those additives into it. The meat can absolutely hold itself together. So I season once it's on the grill or the griddle. Obviously, I like to use my own seasoning, the Hardcore Carnivore Black. And I like, if I'm doing a charcoal grill, there's two different things. So in my cookbook, I made a point to have two different burgers, the smash burger and then the steakhouse burger, because you're either someone who likes a really chunky patty, which is what I would call a steakhouse burger, or you like a thin, crispy edged burger, which is that traditional smash burger. And they're going to have two completely different techniques. So for the chunkier, thicker burgers, I'd say anything over, you know, a half pound or more, a third of a pound. I would set up my grill to have some scattered coals in the bottom so that way you're getting direct heat, but you're not going to get any flare-ups because those burgers, especially with that 80/20 plus, is going to drip down onto the coals. And for burgers, I just leave them for a couple minutes each side because you do want to make sure that ground beef is cooked all the way through. Whereas for steaks, I am a huge fan of constantly flipping it over really high heat. But if you do love that really fast food style smash burger, a griddle is absolutely the way to go.
Yeah. Or a skillet, I guess, cast iron skillet.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much. You need that smooth metal surface. You need to make a lot of contact, really smash that meat down. And that's how you get all those lacy edges.
This makes me want to make a burger tonight.
I will say the other thing that's a must, Sid, is I have to buy my American cheese freshly sliced from the deli. It is a game changer compared to the plastic wrap stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. And getting your meat from the meat counter.
Yes, from the meat counter, or if you have a store that grinds fresh in store and has it on the shelf, that'll work as well.
So, Jess, you're someone who cooks on social media a lot. You're always doing kind of, demos and giving people some insight into what you're doing on TikTok and Instagram. And I'm wondering if there is a recipe that sort of surprised you with the reception it got, something that maybe became a runaway hit or that really generated a lot of interest.
Oh, gosh. I think the recipes that do the best are always the most approachable. I think I went through a stage of trying to sort of prove, I mean, I'm not a trained chef. I'm just someone who loves to eat and loves to cook. And I went through a stage of trying to prove to myself that I could, attempt all these fancy sauces and presentation styles. And that's not what a lot of folks are looking for. So the best success has been with the most approachable. Some of them are embarrassingly easy, I must tell you. We did a recipe once that was bacon wrapped pickles that then went into the smoker, and that ended up with millions of views. But who doesn't love bacon, right?
Yeah.
And nowadays it's the videos that I do that are just more meat info. So showing people how to butcher cuts or explaining, hey, choose this steak over this steak and here's why. I think anything that gives people a sense of value or empowerment in understanding what their choices are at the meat counter, which is exactly where I came from. Like that's a part I suppose I don't talk about enough, that while I did fall in love with barbecue and learn a lot about it, at the same time, when you learn about the raw product and the raw brisket and understanding how to trim brisket and all of that, you start learning about meat in general, buying it in its raw form. And I was so fascinated to sort of unlock all of these things, demystify all of these rumors and misconceptions that I had about buying meat and the meat industry. That's what I started sharing with people way back when. And it just really resonates. I think a lot of folks are skeptical. They don't feel confident in what they're looking at. They're not really sure if they can trust the grocery store, the meat company. And so, you get rumors about what's in hot dogs and what might actually be in ground beef. Spoiler alert, it's beef. So those are the things that I really enjoy sharing with people. I think it's important for people to feel confident in their own choices when they buy.
There's really nothing more iconic when it comes to Texas barbecue than brisket.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also a notoriously challenging thing to cook well. It's hard to get it right. Takes a lot of practice. But when you do, there's nothing better. Do you feel like you've kind of cracked the code on that, and or is it sort of a constant process of experimentation?
I will say, the folks who work as pit masters have the advantage of repetition, which makes anybody an incredible maestro at their game. Because there's always going to be a variable in that the animal, it's not a widget, it's a natural product. The size of the brisket is going to vary. The meat quality, the grading, the tenderness, the toughness. And until you just get dozens of hours under your belt of brisket after brisket after brisket, and I'm not talking about dozens of hours in terms of one brisket cook. I mean, really putting in the time at a smoker, cooking 32 briskets at a time, getting to feel them all. That's why it's such a, you hear the word craft barbecue bandied around a lot, because no two are going to be ready at the same time. And a lot of modern pit masters are taught to feel for it. So I'm definitely very confident with my brisket recipe and advising people how to cook a brisket, but there will absolutely be things that I will still learn along the way too.
Could you see yourself opening a barbecue place someday?
Man, I don't know. I have an enormous amount of respect for the people who do, because it is a labor of love. And in fact, we've started to see, it's quite interesting in the past few months, a few places close that have been around for a long time, that I think are victim to so many people just getting into the industry. It's incredibly tough work. It's incredibly tough to turn a profit. You lose so much in the meat itself. It's expensive. I can't say that it's jumped out at me. I'd love to have a luxury steakhouse one day where I can invite all my friends and give them a great cold gin martini and a lovely selection of steaks. That would be really fun.
Well, let me know when you open that, okay?
Absolutely. You'll be on our guest invite.
Jess, I'm someone who loves to fry a turkey. And particularly at Thanksgiving, it's kind of a tradition in our family. And I noticed that you have a fried turkey seasoning as one of your seasonings. Tell me about that one and what you like about it, and should I give it a try this year?
Absolutely. We'll get you taken care of. That's our seasonal flavor. So that was our first and only flavor that rotates in and out just for the holidays. And I started to think about the folks who do fry turkeys and how popular that's gotten. And a lot of the time, if you apply traditional seasoning to it, especially a seasoning that's got a lot of sugar or a lot of dark red color in it, you'll often get that nearly looks like a soot appearance on the outside of the turkey, because it's really important to make sure the turkey's properly cooked. It needs to stay in the oil for a while. And so I thought about developing a seasoning that had all of the holiday flavors. So sage and garlic. And of course, I'm in Texas, so we put a little bit of jalapeno powder in there as well.
Oh, I like the sound of that. Yeah.
And then the main thing I did was engineer it. The color in the bottle is not it's sort of like a light golden sand color. So the idea is it can turn a deep golden when it fries rather than getting really dark and burnt. And I like to apply it to the turkey beforehand. And then as soon as it comes out of the oil, I give it a light dusting so that you get different dimensions to the freshness of the spice when it's raw compared to cooked. So we'll definitely have to get you a bottle, Sid.
But it's not a replacement for a salt, or like you don't put this on overnight and leave it overnight. It's more you put it on kind of right before it goes in.
Yeah, I mean, I always welcome people to experiment with what they prefer. I've always applied it right before it's gone in, or let it sat for 15 minutes just to adhere. Especially if you're going to be brining a turkey, to apply a seasoning and then leave it overnight, you really risk doubling down on the salt. And if you're not buying a sort of heritage bird that's fresh and you're buying one from the grocery store, a lot of them these days are what we call enhanced poultry. So they already have a solution injected into them that's basically a pre-brine. And unfortunately, it's got a really bad rap. With a lot of people, they think, oh, it's water weight to increase it. And pork ribs often have the same thing with added moisture or enhanced pork ribs. They'll sometimes add some flavor into the turkey at the end of the year. But it was all coming from a place where the industry needed to respond to poor customer experience. I mean, we all know that turkey is notoriously dry if you overcook it. And so the turkey industry and the pork industry wanted to take steps that helped make it even easier for someone not to mess up in their own kitchen. And that's where the idea of that enhanced injected bird comes from. And so if you do buy one, it is always clearly labeled on the label. It is not a bad thing. It just means you don't have to brine it because it's already had some work done to it. Because the whole idea of brining, of course, is just to add in additional moisture to make up for the moisture that's lost during cooking so that it should be as juicy as when you started off. And you want to be careful not to double down too much if you do have an enhanced bird, because you don't want to oversalt it.
Interesting. So read the label.
Definitely.
Yeah.
That helps.
Well, Jess, I just have one more question for you. You grew up in Australia. but you've lived in Texas for an awfully long time now. So I feel like I can ask this question. What does it mean to you to be a Texan?
Belonging to a group of people who are fiercely proud of their old heritage and their new heritage as it evolves. Welcoming folks to the state who feel the same way about it as they do, because I have since welcomed other people here. If you are really good at Google searching, there is a video of me when I moved to Texas. I don't know how we got to do this, but at the time, Chief Justice Willett of the Texas Supreme Court, who's now gone on to bigger and better things, he agreed to swear me in the Texas state capitol as an honorary Texan. And we created this oath. I mean, it's very unofficial, but it is also at the same time somewhat official. And the oath swore allegiance to the great state of Texas, its hospitality and traditions like football, two-stepping, and barbecue. But all of those, I think, are related to hospitality and a warmth that Texans have.
That's great. Well, I love that, and I'm gonna seek that out. I would love to. I would love to see that. It sounds like it's something that should be made official for sure.
Definitely. Hey, if they want to give me a flag that's been flying over the Capitol, I certainly won't say no.
Well, Jess Pryles, congrats on the new show, and look forward to seeing you in Birmingham soon, and for the Food Plus Fire event, which is going to be great. Can't wait to have you here. And thanks so much for being on Biscuits and Jam.
You bet. I'm really excited to come out and meet everyone.
We'll see you soon.
Cheers.